Hello, everyone, again, and welcome to the workshop entitled Understanding the EU Taxonomy, part of our EU Landscape series that we organize for the second cohort of startups enrolled in the Synergies TIC program. Today's session will be delivered by Dawn Slevin, Managing Director of ELS Europe. Dawn has over 28 years of experience as a market-leading consultant, providing sustainable finance and environmental risk management solutions to the finance community and real economy actors. She was endorsed by the European Commission decision for the position of Chair of European Financial Reporting Advisory Group Sustainability Reporting Board. Dawn has previously held position in the European Commission as co-chair, the not significant harm of the EU Taxonomy, and as co-chair of EFRAG's project task force on reporting on non-financial risk and opportunities. Her professional focus is to facilitate organizations to achieve sustainability objectives of net zero CO2 emissions, climate adaptation, circular economy, protection of water resources and biodiversity, and pollution prevention, while supporting a prosperous and fair business environment and economy. In doing so, she provides strategic advice and technical expertise on international environmental risk management and sustainable finance to clients from financial sector, industry sector, business and innovation platforms, as well as regulatory and prudential authorities. Dawn works collaboratively with the FinTech industry on data analytic solution, delivers training to clients, and has lectured at the university level. This session will begin with Dawn's presentation and the Q&A session will follow. So please prepare your questions. You can also leave them in the chat during the presentation and I will make sure they will be addressed afterwards. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Dawn. We are glad to have you here and eager to learn more about the EU taxonomy. So whenever you're ready, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Denisa, and thank you for inviting me to speak this morning to the accelerator startup companies who are working to introduce new technologies, new ways of thinking into our economic system to help move towards a low carbon, resource efficient economy, a sustainable economy. And you've given a very comprehensive introduction there. As Denisa had said, ELS Europe is a sustainability consultancy. We work with financial and non-financial organizations, and our mission is to redirect financial flows towards environmentally and socially sustainable processes, technologies, and economic activities. And we want to help build opportunities for the creation of green-collar jobs to support our sustainable global economy. And we do this through our technical skills across many of the economic sectors of the EU taxonomy, our strategic risk management, our in-depth knowledge of sustainability-related data acquisition and disclosures, which I'll talk to you about today, and our knowledge of the regulatory frameworks, both on the prudential and on the non-financial or technical areas in the EU and internationally, and also our training, knowledge exchange, and consultation skills. So Denise mentioned that I co-chaired both the do no significant harm technical screening criteria of the EU taxonomy for the climate objectives, and also received last year, very, very proud to have achieved the UN ISAR award for our work with EFRAG on risks and opportunities, and the report and annexes that we produce and podcasts. And I will be talking to you about disclosures because it's one of the big drivers of the EU sustainability agenda and sustainable finance framework, as the taxonomy is the key and central tool on that. And that's what our topic is about, the EU taxonomy. And I was very proud to have received Sustainable Finance Person of the Year award in Ireland in 2019 as well. So what am I going to talk about, just to break it down in terms of, the requests that I received from the Spheric Accelerator program? it's for you. So I'm really aiming this for startups and for tech startups. So I'm not going to be talking about all of the EU taxonomy sectors. I'm going to focus on those that are relevant to what I've seen just from a preview and a cursory view of the accelerator program. I want to explain the key sustainability risks and opportunities that we've observed here in ELS Europe. So it's putting a lens on that. I will then explain the EU taxonomy and some insights into the application of the taxonomy. I want to provide some examples of technical screening criteria for those of you who may not have used the taxonomy previously. And I want to present that in a context that is relevant for the synergistic startups. Again, talking about the sectors that are relevant to you, but also the technical screening criteria involved. So, so first of all, talking about the risks and opportunities, I'm going to look at this from three levels. The international level, our emissions gap. I have been asked to focus on climate. I will talk about other objectives, biodiversity and circular economy, but we can't cover everything in this short frame of time. And I'm going to also look at it from market level, the risks and opportunities for tech startups, and then talk about company level. So what are the challenges that companies of all sizes are experiencing right now in helping to shift our economy to a sustainable one? So the United Nations Environment Programme has published this emissions gap report since 2015, and there are many global reports. The World Economic Forum publishes one regularly as well. So there are a number of different sources, as well as, of course, the IPCC reports. But this one, I think, gives a really comprehensive review, and it assesses the gap between the commitments made by governments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and those needed to achieve the global temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. And in 2023, the most recent UNEP report, the emissions gap report, shows that globally 57 gigatons of CO2 equivalent was emitted during the year. This is another new record, and it's an increase of 1.2% from 2022 GHG emissions. Also, we see that the GHG emissions across the G20 members has increased, and they account for 77% of global emissions. And the UNEP report considers that cuts of 42% are needed by 2030 and 57% by 2035 to get on track for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So in a word, we have reasons to be concerned, and we aren't achieving the goals that certainly have been set out globally, and we need to keep that in mind. So your work as innovators in this area and devoting your careers to this area is very, very important. So now look at it from a market level, and this is data that Bloomberg have just published publicly this week, in fact, and they're showing that after record investments in clean energy technologies in 2023, and I believe for that in the preceding year, they reached 1.7 trillion, particularly for energy, solar, batteries, carbon capture storage, hydrogen. Received a lot of investment. So you're looking at very large scale clean tech. I know you're in the smaller scale of things at the moment, but obviously we'll move up that ladder as your companies evolve. But in 2024, the investments halved. So there are some market pressures now as venture capitalists are starting to look towards AI data techs. Now, I want to give a little bit more context on that. And from Bloomberg's reports, the reason cited that the investments in clean tech and climate tech companies have reduced is because they're moving into a very capital intensive stage for never before deployed technologies, and they are finding some scaling up of technologies to be challenging. And simply AI since 23 has been competing for VC investments. And whilst it requires build out and capital, it's not considered as technologically risky. But as we all know, AI centers, data centers are power hungry and rely on fossil fuels. So, in fact, by turning to AI, which is proven to be fossil fuel hungry, in fact, they're undermining the goals of the Paris Agreement. So there are really drivers here that need to be looked at from your perspective. Which are firstly, there is lots of appetite in the market for climate technology, no question about that. Also, governments are being given a stronger mandate, not only, for example, in Europe from the requirements of the European Commission and the Parliament and the Council on member states, but also by voters to implement policies that support low carbon economies. And so there is probably opportunities around shifting AI and bringing it into the clean tech and climate tech, as opposed to seeing it as the competitor that's sucking up all the oxygen. And, that's really something for you to think about. But these are the most recent data that we're looking at. And you're talking about, I believe, for the last quarter of 24, an order of 10 billion, as you can see there at the very right-hand bottom corner of that graph. So there are still large amounts globally being invested in clean tech, and so we have to consider it in that context. And then the company challenges, risks and opportunities, but there are challenges in there. I'm looking here at evolving regulation. Take Europe, for example. There's been quite a lot of regulation that's been coming in since we first developed EU Taxonomy, which we started in 2018. And companies are achieving what's been required there. A lot of it is around disclosures. So they're not being compelled necessarily, depending on what sector they're in, to take measures, but they are being compelled to report on it. And so the European Sustainability Reporting Standards will ultimately apply to approximately 50,000 companies. There's over 1,000 data points, and companies, have to undertake materiality assessments, consider their transition planning, carry out impact risks and opportunities, evaluations across, their GHG emissions, their impact on biodiversity, on sustainable water resource use, etc. And what we find is that there is a lack of reporting on scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And this particularly, impacts on financial reporting because it's their scope 3, their investments in companies. Are they investing in clean tech, low carbon, environmentally friendly companies? And this is all part of the narrative that is coming through in the disclosures, in the harvesting of information, as well as the preparers and how they're putting information out into the global publications. Companies are grappling with administrative costs, staff training, understanding the new regulations, implementing their own internal requirements, audit assurance, their IT systems, evaluating potential risks and liabilities that are legal, contractual, reputational, etc. And also looking at the interoperability between financial and non-financial key performance indicators, the new regulations that are coming in within jurisdictions, and also how that applies to them globally, and technically on the ground as well for their operations, climate laws and environmental laws. So there's a lot that businesses have to grapple with to bed these requirements into their operations and procedures. So the next part of the talk, I'm going to now delve into the EU taxonomy and give you a little bit more of an introduction to it. So the taxonomy is a unified EU classification system, and it enables the categorization of economic activities and at macro sector and at sector level across now with all of the delegated acts having been published: climate change mitigation, adaptation, protection of biodiversity, sustainable use of water, pollution prevention, and the transition to the circular economy. But in order for an economic activity to be deemed taxonomy aligned, and that's the ultimate goal. First of all, they must be eligible, so it must be a sector that has got technical screening criteria written in the taxonomy. But there are ways that companies can make a case to the platform, which is the governance body that has been operating since 2020 and is continuing the work that we commenced in the first TEG. But first of all, they have to be eligible. So they have to be an economic activity listed in the taxonomy. They must substantially contribute to at least one of the environmental objectives, and the technical screening criteria are the detail around that. They must meet the do no significant harm technical screening criteria, and they must meet all of the minimum social safeguards, which is a floor. They don't have technical screening criteria, but they are based on UN and ILO principles, and they must be met by the entities at entity level. So I'm going to focus on the environmental objectives for our discussion. And these are the 6 environmental objectives. And the Climate Delegated Act, or regulation as it's termed, was published in June 2021. So that was one that we worked on the TEG and produced the first body of technical screening criteria for substantial contribution and do no significant harm. And that was amended, has been amended a couple of times since then. And then the environmental delegated regulation, which is published in 2023, is dealing with the substantial contribution and do no harm for the remaining environmental objectives, the 6 objectives. There was also quite a lot of work done on developing criteria for the social objectives, but that hasn't been published into legislation. And I believe that's not expected for some time. So just from your standpoint as climate startup companies, just to mention that there are 3 types of activities, and I'm going to focus here on the climate delegated regulation. And this is part of the transition journey for the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and also adaptation and climate resilience of entities. So the taxonomy isn't an in and out or a win and lose classification system. It is, which would risk creating a green bubble or sidelining or causing divestment for companies. It's a tool to encourage companies to shift and for investors to do so as well, to encourage them. And all companies have a requirement to disclose so that the primary investors, that's you and me who invest in our pension plans and various other plans, are able to understand where our investments are going. So the taxonomy itself has created 3 types of activities in the climate mitigation area. Those that already contribute to low carbon, and these activities include zero emissions transport, renewable energies like solar and wind, and these are likely to be stable and long term. And then there are transition activities, and these are subject to regular revision. So in the taxonomy, it states that these will be reviewed, usually 3 to 5 year revision process. And these significantly enhance the overall performance of an activity. They must have no feasible low carbon alternative in the market, but they do reflect best in class performance. And to give an example, hybrid cars have been eligible if they achieve minimum of 50 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilometre. Electricity generation that's below 100 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour would be transition. And the idea is that these would be ramped up over time towards net zero. And then there are activities that enable these substantial contribution, own performance and transition activities to achieve. And that's where a lot of the tech companies, especially the startups, your types of businesses come in. I'm not going to say it's exclusive, but it is where I see from looking at your business models, a lot of you are enabling. And so an enabling activity actually helps those companies to achieve substantial contribution. And this could be anything from manufacturing of components for wind turbines to data tech, data centers, and some other activities that I'll talk about, as well as insurance lines of business, which would be an enabling sector for the adaptation, substantial contribution to adaptation. So that's to launch you into some of the more technical detail of it. So well, I've summarized here, I can't say for certain I have all of them here, but 15 of the macro sectors. And you can see, for example, if you look at manufacturing, which is the third down there, that in those subsectors that fall under the macro sector of manufacturing, there is an opportunity for a manufacturer to substantially contribute to 5 of the 6 environmental objectives. If you're in the accommodation sector, really the only objective you would be contributing to would be the protection of biodiversity of ecosystems. If you're in the information and communication sector, again, quite a number of environmental objectives that you can substantially contribute to. So there would be subsectors within that macro sector that if you're operating under those that you can contribute to. Now, it's not hard and fast rules. There could be many sectors and subsectors across these macro sectors that a company, depending on their business model, could substantially contribute to. And number 1 up there is automatic substantial contribution. And this refers to renewable energy such as solar and wind, which have no substantial contribution technical screening criteria because they automatically substantially contribute. But they would have to adhere to the do no significant harm and the minimum safeguards. And so this kind of gives you a good picture of how much of the economy is covered at the present time by the EU taxonomy. Pardon me, I didn't hear that question.
No, I think it was just someone joining and Michael was not muted.
Okay, no worries. And this just gives you a conceptual model of how is all of this going to work its way through our non-financial sector and our financial sector. So basically, if you're a company and you have one or more lines of business that are eligible for the EU taxonomy, and this diagram looks at eligibility, and say, for example, 40% of your activity is eligible, and of that, another smaller percent is actually aligned. We'll get onto that discussion of aligned. Investors would then use your equities to develop out their portfolios and weight the portfolios accordingly. And so you do get what we call these Article 9 funds, which have EU taxonomy alignment. And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty around all the fund names, but effectively, ultimately, companies that are EU taxonomy eligible and aligned can be used to weight this by virtue of their revenue. And they must report the revenue so that this is transparent to investors so they know how aligned companies are. And the legislation actually has templates for non-financial companies to report on taxonomy alignment. And you see here, this is actually from the legislation. Here under A, companies have to report their taxonomy eligible activities. So this is a proportion of turnover. Then they have to break that down into which activities substantially contribute to each one of the 6 environmental objectives. Do they meet the do no significant harm technical screening criteria? Are they a transition or enabling? Are they categorized as that? This is on the far right, E&T. And ultimately, they have to aggregate that data so that investors are taking well-constructed data from companies in a consistent manner and are able to make those calculations on their portfolios and the weighting of the companies in their portfolios that are taxonomy aligned. So what I'm showing you here is that over the years since we started work on the taxonomy, the legislation has come in to this level 2 legislation, which is actually giving the templates to companies as well as the guidance to the financial sector on how to aggregate that data. And each has their own disclosure rules around this. So now I'm going to get into really, I suppose, really, which is what you want, to hear a bit more about is what does this mean for you, your organizations? Now, I don't know the size of your companies. I haven't looked into the size of them. I'm presuming you're micro or small SMEs, which at this time, it's very unlikely that these rules around disclosure would apply to you. However, as enabling companies, you will want to know how these rules would apply to your client base or to your prospective client base when you hit the marketplace, and you need to understand how you're going to help leverage them and enable them and what their requirements are, as well as understanding how they approach their business model, their strategy for impacts, risks, and opportunities, their materiality assessments, understand the challenges that they're experiencing so that you can help with their pain points. So there's a lot to take in terms of helping companies meet the goals of Paris alignment and the objectives of, in Europe, the EU Green Deal, but internationally as well, many more conventions. So we are looking here at the climate delegated regulation. There are economic activities. I'm just taking a sample of them here, but I believe these would be very close to some of your business models. Data processing, hosting, and related activities is an eligible economic activity. Data-driven solutions for greenhouse gas emission reductions is an eligible activity. Manufacture of low carbon technologies for transport, manufacture of other low carbon technologies. So again, these are enabling activities that enable the other sectors to meet their goals. And also a lot of, installation, maintenance, repair. In this case, I'm looking at energy efficient equipment, charging stations for e-vehicles, instruments for controlling energy performance of buildings, etc. So, and these would include not only the manufacture, but the maintenance and installation as well. And you'll see there is an evolution between the Climate Delegated Act and the Environmental Delegated Act. I think the Commission was getting better at being more inclusive. So they're very inclusive. It's not a black and white of, well, you must be in this sector. It would be associated with these sectors in the NACE codes, and the NACE codes are used to classify economic activities. So what I'm looking at here is a little closer look at manufacture of other low carbon technologies. So this is manufacture of tech aimed at GHG emission reductions in other sectors of the economy. And this is an enabling activity. And some of the synergistic companies that were either in this cohort and in the previous cohort that may be in this general direction. I, again, haven't studied the business models. In reducing energy consumption would be 3D components, AS, and Green Door, for example. And when you look at the technical screening criteria, I wanted to give you an example. So first of all, the economic activity manufactures technologies that are aimed at and demonstrate full substantial life cycle. So we're looking at life cycle GHG emission savings compared to the best performing on the market. So as part of that proof that a company is aligned, they would need to look at the best performing performing one on the market. And if there isn't one, then they make the case, well, we are the only performing one on the market. And then you would have to get your life cycle GHG emission savings calculated using these international standards that are cited or equivalent, and have that verified by an independent third party. And then there are technical requirements for do no significant harm across the 5 environmental objectives. So that is another layer of confirmation that you're meeting these requirements. And then that company would be deemed to be EU Taxonomy aligned. Again, as long as they meet the minimum safeguards, which again is at entity level and based on international labour laws, the UN Global Compact and other requirements. So there are a couple of other sectors, and I just didn't want to leave out. I'm trying to include as many of the companies in synergistic in this discussion as possible. I mentioned data-driven solutions for greenhouse gas emissions. Some of the companies that I saw that could potentially be operating under this economic sector is Solsign, Multifluid X, Archie9, which also I think might be an own performance, being that it is a substantially contributing in its own right to the sector, not only as an enabler. Tracken and Enorma. So they seem to have a business model that applies to this sector. And then also for low carbon technologies for transport, Quickie, Pulse Hub, Cedrion, and Along Route appear to me to be potentially operating in these sectors. Then if we look at the climate adaptation objective, and Denise, you could tell me if I'm running over time. I warned you that I get into the technical aspects of this.
You can take as much time as you want.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. So climate adaptation is built differently to climate mitigation. It's generally the same sectors. There are a few additional ones. I mentioned financial sector. For example, insurance can substantially contribute. But there's too much in the technical screening criteria to put in here. But generally, these companies are software enabling for physical climate risk management and adaptation. So they could be producing services and products for forecasting, projection of climate events, monitoring of climate risks, early warning systems for climate risks, and supporting climate risk management. And they are enabling activities. There are some particular exclusions that you'll see in the scope of these activities, but that is because they're already covered under other macro sectors. So again, they could also fall under those and more. And some of the businesses that appear to fall under this would be Xsoft, Astrotech, and Planet AI Space. And this brings in, a lot of other environmental objectives, because biodiversity is so important for adaptation. So there's scope for a lot of other businesses to be included in this. So that's the eligibility. That's what you need to be doing in order to be eligible. Now, once you know that you're eligible, then these are the technical screening criteria. And I don't have all the details here, but your activity must remove information, technological or capacity barriers to adaptation. So it's quite open to interpretations, quite qualitative. You use a methodology that's based on best practices, is consistent with international best practices, that any software that's developed is targeted at enabling. It doesn't adversely affect the adaptation efforts of others, very important. It favors nature-based solutions and is consistent with local, sectoral, regional, and national adaptation strategies. So in a sense, it all makes sense that you fit in with what your, the local region that you're covering, be it national or international, and also that your product is monitored and measured against predefined indicators, so that you can see the performance of it and improvements in it. So quite, I would say, qualitative activities, technical screening criteria, excuse me. And for this particular activity, there are do no significant harm technical screening criteria. So it's NA across all of them. So, the build out of this said, well, really, there's really no risk, significant risk to the do no significant harm objectives of the taxonomy. So now I'm going to kind of delve into the environmental delegated regulation. This was for the 4 environmental objectives. We looked at the climate 2 objectives there. And some of the activities that are in there are provision of IT, OT, information technology, operational technology, data-driven solutions for leakage reduction. So this would be in the wastewater or water provision industry. And also IT, OT for circular economy objective. And I did note as well, whilst there is an enabling activity for conservation and restoration, there is no question that a number of the businesses in Synergistic are actually enabling conservation. And whilst there is no activity, again, I mentioned to you that the platform is set up there as the governance. So companies can make the case that we are enabling here and we want to bring this forward as an enabling activity. So it doesn't mean that you walk away and say, well, there's no space for us there. You make the space in that sense. And you know, again, that requires obviously engagement with the Commission's platform. And so let's have a look at the sustainable use of water objective. Here, in order to be eligible, the activity manufactures, develops, installs, deploys, maintains. So it's getting, you know, more descriptive about the range of industries that can be included, or provides professional services for design or monitoring for IT or OT data-driven solutions to manage, reduce, and mitigate leakage. So that is very, very broad. And it's an enabling activity. And some of the companies that perhaps could potentially, you know, fall under this are OptiSun, Conry Innovation, and Inorma. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing all of these. Inorma. So, you know, because they're involved in the clean water resources and sector. Then we have the technical screening criteria. Again, I'm not going to go into all of them here, but you can see again that it's quite qualitative. Again, there's a requirement to monitor and show how they're performing, that they can be used for controlling, managing, and mitigating water leakage. You know, part of their requirement is that they aren't causing any environmental degradation risks. And the taxonomy, because it's EU-based, really leans on the Water Framework Directive so that you're not, you know, you're avoiding water stress and you're helping to achieve good water status. So it's quite a broad qualitative type of requirement, but nonetheless, companies would be able to show and demonstrate that they are not undermining the objectives of the Water Framework Directive and meet that substantial contribution criterion. And then for do no harm, there are criteria under adaptation. Again, you're not undermining adaptation efforts of others, etc. For circular economy and also for pollution prevention and control, so that, you know, your solution is not, you know, increasing possibility of pollution or release of pollutants. So they are the technical screening criteria as a heads up. Then I wanted to talk about tech and the biodiversity objective. So this was one where I'm saying that there is not an enabling activity, but when you look at some of the business models of the synergistic EIC companies, you see that they support organic and regenerative agriculture. Agriculture is not currently on the EU taxonomy. It was discussed at length. It, in fact, had been drafted in our first tranche in the period 2018-2020, but was not published on the regulation. But again, I would say that taxonomies are being developed by international regions. There are over 30 of them at the moment, and some of them do include agriculture. So whilst these may not apply directly in the EU taxonomy, and they do indirectly, there is no question about it, they would apply in other international taxonomies as well. And so these companies are using AI, we're back to our AI discussion, and technology for soil and biodiversity protection, smart farm robotics, Luxseed robotics, Microfy AI, Ondo, World from Space and regrowth appear potentially to operate in this sector, and also monitoring and other low carbon technologies that minimize risk to birds and wildlife, protected birds and wildlife, which are a particular concern, and support regenerative agri, such as AgroVisio, Raw Windy Agrotech, Send Solutions, and again, Planet AI Space, which potentially applies under another environmental objective. So the technical screening criteria again are qualitative, and these apply to the, I suppose, really the entity that these tech companies are enabling, in that they're initiating, developing, and realizing on own account or on a fair contract basis conservation activities, including restoration activities, aimed at maintaining and improving the status and trends across water, freshwater, terrestrial ecosystems, and marine ecosystems. And so the technical screening criteria refer to the Convention on Biological Diversity, conservation standards, and also excludes certain activities such as botanical gardens and zoos and seed banks. So it's important to reference the exclusions as well. I'm not going to go into detail on these, but generally the TSC are looking for number one, that it substantially contributes to, as I mentioned, a range of different terrestrial and marine and freshwater ecosystems. It must be able to describe the area, so a mapping of where they're actually making a substantial contribution. Again, as enablers, you would enable that. They must develop a management plan. They must carry out audit of the achievement, and they must also guarantee permanence. And they are the 5 key areas that are required to be covered with far more detail than in the technical screening criteria that must be met. And that brings my discussion to you to an end, and I'm happy to take any questions from you.
Thank you very much, Dawn, and for the extensive presentation, also for this first screening of the startups and providing them with the useful tips and personalized. I don't see any questions in the chat, so if anyone else has a question, please just unmute yourself and speak. I'm guessing everyone is overwhelmed with information right now.
Well, I'm glad I've given everyone lots to think about. And by all means, you can contact me if you have any particular questions. And it's the taxonomy, as I said, is a tool. So I think it might be the starting point for you if you haven't already, to delve into it and have a look at it. There's a lot of talk about the EU taxonomy, and you'll hear different things coming from different actors, but you really need to get a sense of it for yourself. And I hope that's what you've got from this discussion, and maybe it'll give you some more food for thought for the development of your businesses, and how also you engage with investors and the points that you would bring to them about the benefits that your business brings in the context of the taxonomy.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very good point, and they are actually at the moment talking with investors. We are matchmaking them with the different investors, depending on what our colleagues from Fast Track are about tracking and GeForce, and it will be helpful for sure. Magdalena, did you wanted to say anything or have a question?
I understand that it is a very full of things, this domain, and quite hard to understand from half-a-minute session presentation. I think there are a lot to talk about this taxonomy and green industry, of course, but what I truly believe, considering your slides, is that startups should be very much encouraged to invest in green technologies, in the context of which they bring positive change. Europe wants to be green 100%, but today it is very difficult to imagine how we will do this because we are in lack of infrastructure. So we have goals, but we do not have sufficient infrastructure to implement these goals. So once a startup comes with a green idea, then it should be encouraged to develop as fast as possible if you want to move forward up to 2030, though the time is short. So yeah, and a lot less bureaucracy in this particular time. So startups should have enough time to innovate and build the teams so they bring innovation and in a way simplify the bureaucracy for this project. So this is my conclusion: less bureaucracy and more innovation in the physical form.
I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, a lot of this, the EU Green Deal and a lot of the regulations and the taxonomy seem to speak more to big companies in that, we want to encourage small companies and startup companies, but to get on that ladder is quite difficult, and we see it in a lot of areas. And, it'd be interesting for you to elaborate on the infrastructure in particular that you would be referring to in the context of your business. But I think that definitely we see it with a lot of other areas, in terms of like EU green bonds, issuances as well. It's usually big players that are there in the marketplace, and this is what it speaks to, when what you really want to be doing is bringing in innovation, new ways of looking at things, an appetite to make a change, because you are starting in an area and all your days are spent working on this and shifting everything. And if you're meeting these, infrastructural barriers, then they have to be removed. You have to have a way that you can get over them as a small business and get through to where you could start scaling up your ideas.
And a way addressing differently to startups and corporations, because corporations have the means, the big companies have the means, the teams, the resources to, work on this bureaucracy part. But the startups don't have this, because multiple times in the first 2 years of a startup, there are only 2, 3, or 4 people that are working, and they are struggling with their own resources, with their own knowledge in order to develop something that is quite hard to bring on the market. If we talk about something that is hardware, if we talk about software, there is another discussion. But when we build things, innovations in a way, or inventions in another way, then we should take a different perspective in what funding or European funding means. So these are two different things, areas actually, that needs to be discussed in order to create advantages for founders of startups and the co-founders of startups, because it's a big struggle in the first 2 to 3 years. I mean, actually 1 to 3 years. It's a big struggle especially in countries like, for example, in Romania. I can talk to you hours and hours, the struggling that we have when we develop objects, hardware. So yeah, this would be another session maybe of discussion.
Yeah, and I think as well that it would be really good to have this discussion and tease it out and make that recommendation to the European Commission and say, look, we are on this. We know what you're trying to achieve here. We're behind it. In fact, we've devoted X amount of years of our lives to doing this. These are the challenges. What are you going to do to change them? And I have spoken at innovation conferences with Commission. But I think that this direct route, where you formulate the challenges and also propose how they can do it, so you become part of the solution, you're heard, number one, and the hope would be that it trickles into, at national level as well, where you get that support, but also that the legislation takes into consideration micro companies and SMEs who are going to, provide enabling services, but also who themselves are going to need to respond to these regulations as they grow, and that they're given the support to do that.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot that could be taken from this to move forward and to help, especially where ye are now. And I'd be interested in learning more about where your journey is, where all of your journey is. And, is it that venture capital is that who your investors are? Or are they other types of investors? And what are the challenges in the marketplace for you as well as the bureaucratic, more red tape area?
We can send you a material of challenges and some solutions of these challenges in order to forward to the European Commission. Or we should do it because we can send you this material from our startup, I mean.
Yeah, well, I'd be interested in having that dialogue with you and shaping that. And by all means, I think why not? Let's do that. Let's work towards achieving that.
Okay. I will talk with my colleagues, and in the near future, I will not give you a specific date because there is a lot to discuss and write. But I will take your email, and once we have something like a frame of our materials, I will send you an email, and then we will see from there where to go.
Sounds good.
We can also provide you some intros with Dawn, so you have every startup has her contacts, and you can follow up after the Synergies TIC program, and of course, explore more on these opportunities.
Great.
Perfect. Thank you. If anyone else has a question, if not, in the chat is just a big thank you for the excellent presentation from one of the participants. So I'm guessing that. So thank you again, Dawn, for accepting our invitation. It was great to have you here and also to learn more about your extensive experience with the taxonomy. And hopefully we will sync with one another soon in another context.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and let's do that. We'll talk again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.